Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Thomas Hale. I'm a professor in the Blavatnik School of Government, and it's a great pleasure to be here today with our guest, Dr. Yannick Glemarec, who is the Executive Director of the Green Climate Fund. It's a very optimum time to be speaking about the state of climate finance because, as all of you will know, the world will be gathering next week in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt for the 27th Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And if you've paid any attention to the COP process, which I'm sure many of you have, you'll know that this COP is really about implementation and delivery, and how do we make progress on the commitments and the pledges that have been made. And what does it take to make progress and to implement, to take action? It takes finance, it takes money. And so a huge focus of attention on this COP is around how we finance mitigation, adaptation, and indeed a growing chorus of voices calling for financing around the impacts of climate change and losses and damage associated with that. So finance is really the center, I would say, of this regime in a way that's always been the case, but even more intensely so. So we're extremely lucky to hear from Dr. Glemarec today. But it's also an interesting topic that he's chosen because the title of our talk today is, of course, philosophy and climate finance. So we're not just going to think about the billions, the trillions that we know we need, but also the broader context around them, which I think is going to be a fascinating discussion. This is going to be is currently being broadcast, so just so you're all aware, it'll be preserved for eternity on the internet, and so act accordingly. And we've asked Yannick to speak for 25 minutes or so to give us a presentation on the state of affairs in climate finance and the philosophies behind it. But we want to save a lot of time for questions and answers, so please be thinking about the questions you have and the discussion that will follow, because that will make this a rich and exciting interaction. And just before passing over to you, Yannick, let me say one word really about the context around it. So, you know, we're in a time where the climate crisis is more intense than ever, but we know we're dealing with a climate crisis that's connected to and indeed intricately linked to an energy crisis, a cost of living crisis, an inflation crisis, and those are of course linked to crises such as the war in Ukraine. And so the COP taking place next week is really dealing it sort of at two levels, the sort of surface level turbulence that we all see in the papers every day, and the deeper waves that are permeating longer term underneath that surface turbulence that are really driving it. And climate finance is obviously a hugely important topic itself, but if you think about it as really how does the world organize itself to create the investments in the longer term that will actually help us control these deeper longer term trends that are creating the surface turbulence, it's actually a pretty existential question for our ability as a civilization to manage our problems, if I can put it as grandiosely as that. And so I think philosophy is indeed needed in this occasion. So without further ado, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Pleasure to be here, Thomas. Good afternoon, everybody, or almost good evening. Many thanks for coming and for inviting me to make this presentation. As the executive coordinator of the Green Climate Fund, most of my presentations are intended to policymakers and to financiers and are about the best mix of policy instruments to catalyze finance. Because we're speaking about a public of academics, I thought that maybe I would take a couple of steps back and discuss about environmental philosophies first before zooming on the climate finance. And this is very much rooted in my own academic experience. As a PhD student, I was working on an environmental decision-making system. And whenever I would present my model to my PhD master, she would tell me, you know, I can see your numbers. I cannot see your philosophy. And this used to puzzle me to eternity. They are thinking, but numbers are numbers. What does philosophy has to do with an algorithm? And she will look at me and she will have this gaze saying, you're not ready yet. But I knew that this was important. I ended up spending my entire professional life trying to respond to this question, what is my environmental philosophy? So environmental philosophies basically are not easy to categorize. They resist a neat categorization. But for climate finance, I came with a 2x2 matrix highlighting 4 key environmental philosophies based on their perception of the role of markets and based on their perception of how to decouple well-being and resource exploitation. So basically naturalism, techno-optimism, egalitarianism, and institutionalism. Naturalism is often called also Malthusianism. The techno-optimism is often called utilitarianism. Institutionalism can be called also sustainable development, green growth, and egalitarianism, for example, in the field of climate change, can be called climate justice. So it's very much depend on the emphasis. But I will try to go very quickly through each of these 4 main schools of thoughts when it comes to environment and when it comes to the optimal set of public policy instruments and intervention to avoid catastrophic climate change. The first one, naturalism. Why naturalism? Is because basically classical economists used to think that the economy was following natural law. And one of those natural laws is that there was a limit to the number of people that could exist on Earth, and that limit was the capacity to feed them. And so one of the most famous naturalists is Thomas Malthus. And according to Piketty, he was terrified about the French Revolution and what was coming from the French Revolution, the abolition of religions, equal right for women and men, the right to divorce, etc. So something that used to horrify the reverend. And he had come to the conclusion that the main reason was because of the population bomb, the demographic explosion that had taken place in France during the 18th century, where the population had grown from 20 millions to 30 millions, and the country had experienced a number of mass famine that had led to the French Revolution. And so for him, his belief was that there was a natural law. You could increase food production only in a linear manner, while population will increase exponentially. So sooner or later, the system will collapse and will lead to scarcity. And his main policy recommendation to avoid environmental collapse was to stop providing any kind of aid to the poor. For me, the naturalist schools is very different from Malthus. That was the opinion of Malthus. When we often call it the Malthusian school, it's actually a disservice to the main thinkers of the naturalist school. And there you will have basically a lot of movement that will insist on the circular economy, reducing, reusing, recycling, renewing. And so with extremely innovative work in terms of, for example, bioremediation from pollution, etc. You will find the main tenets of decentralization, for example, decentralized renewable energy for people to be not only consumers, but also producers. You will have a very strong emphasis on the symbiotic relationship with nature, rather than extractive relationship. And population is still an issue, but the emphasis will be on the planning, on the family planning, and not on the coercion and population control. And you have all the degrowth, zero growth movement, where basically the main belief is that additional growth does not bring additional happiness. What we need is a new humanism. And so I'm sure that all of you can have a picture about this kind of school of thought. And when you read your newspaper, you will see a number of articles where you can clearly see a naturalist thinking. Now, the techno-optimists have a completely different view of the world. Basically, they say that the limits to growth are baloney. They do not exist. And because basically, crisis is mother of invention. Every time you reach a crisis, you will basically drive a new generation of innovation, financial innovation, technological innovation, institutional innovation. And that will push basically this limit to growth. And there is no reason why this innovation should ever come to an end. And actually, additional people, it's additional innovation. And the father of this techno-optimist school is most likely Condorcet. And actually, Malthus, the essay of Malthus, was a response to Condorcet. Condorcet was a French scientist of the same period than Malthus. And for him, basically, progress, technological progress, but also social progress, will bring happiness to the masses. He was an optimist, and a techno-progressist, extremely optimist, and ended up being beheaded during the French Revolution. It's a lot of techno-optimists today are not really techno-progressist. They are more techno-libertarian or techno-liberal. And the type of policy solution they will advocate to avoid catastrophic climate change will be more strengthening property right, and notably based on the idea that anything that does not have clear property right will be abused, so the tragedy of commons. The reason why they are often called utilitarian is also because any kind of investment in environment must be based on a cost-benefit analysis. How much does it cost, and what can I get back from it, in order to make sure that you make the right type of investment in environment, but also you do not prioritize environment against, for example, activities for economic growth, job creation, social development. That at the end of the day, you need to ensure that all your investment basically give you the highest well-being possible. Often this school also advocate deregulation, saying that the regulation are basically a straitjacket to innovation. If we have to rely on innovation to avoid catastrophic climate change, we have to deregulate in order to foster innovation. Certainly the main policy instruments that is being advocated by this school of thought is carbon pricing. The idea that if you price carbon, if you internalize the external cost of carbon pollution through a tax, you will enable financial markets to do what they do best, which is to basically reorient financial flows toward the optimal societal benefits. And also a major policy recommendation of that school is everything that has to do with climate risk disclosure, information disclosure, enabling the public, enabling the investors to basically take into account the climate risk when they make an investment decision. And so there you have a lot of work in terms of establishing green taxonomy, in terms of obliging every single enterprise to disclose what will be the climate risk that they will be facing, etc. And that's the power of information. The idea is that when you provide information to people, when you empower people with information, an optimal societal impact can be expected. So that's the second school of thought, the techno-optimist, often called the utilitarian. The third school of thought actually disagree with that approach, does not disagree about the importance of innovation, but simply says that all this kind of policy recommendation will take far too long to address climate change. That's we have no more than 10 years to avoid catastrophic climate change. When we signed the Paris Agreement in 2015, the likelihood that we will cross the 1.5 degrees Celsius within the next 5 years was 0%. Today, it's 50%. We have a 50% chance to cross at least 1 year, the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's the maximum temperature that we have experienced during the Holocene, during the farming age. And we are on our way to cross the 2 degrees Celsius threshold by between 2045 to 2060, if not earlier. 2 degrees Celsius threshold over the past 2.5 million years during the Pleistocene, the Ice Age. Temperature have moved from -6 degrees Celsius during the Ice Age to +2 during the interglacial. -6 to +2, -6 to +2. And so our species, the Homo sapiens, and all its antecessors have never experienced a temperature higher than 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial time. And so that means by 2045, we might actually see something that nobody has ever seen. And this school basically said there is no way we don't have the time to wait for information, climate risk disclosure to basically move the compass in terms of investment. We don't have enough time for market to self-regulate. We must actually actively, through often industrial policies, shape market, transform them, create new markets. And so that's basically this school is that this scarcity will lead to innovation, but because of socio-economic tipping point and climate tipping point, you can simply not wait for it to happen. We have to take in our hands our own destiny. So for this school, it's all about climate transformation. So you take any kind of green investment. Right now, that does not have a very attractive risk-reward profile because either the risk is deemed as too high because a lot of climate investment use new technologies without a track record, or are taking place in a regulatory framework which is not very supportive, so very high risk, and limited reward because there is a high upfront capital requirement, high capex, and therefore you have a payback period not in 3 years, but maybe 10 years, 12 years. So basically your investment does not have the right risk-reward profile. You are not to do it, it's not attractive. And so the idea is through a number of policy instruments to reduce the risk, and you can, for example, reduce the risk through providing a guarantee. You guarantee a price, you guarantee access to the grid, for example, for renewable energy, or increasing the reward through providing a minimum price where you are sure that to sell your electricity, your green electricity at this minimum price. So that's the main idea behind market transformation. And thousands of instruments have been developed in order to transform this market. Because this one can be very theoretical, I would like to give one example of market transformation. In UK, the contracts for difference. The UK, since 2015, has been organizing auction for renewable energy every 2 years. Last summer, UK did auction 11 gigawatt of renewable energy. So the equivalent of 11 nuclear plants. And using the contract for difference. That means providing a minimum price for the investors to sell the electricity to the grid. And the 11 gigawatt of electricity is enough for meeting the consumption, electrical consumption of 14% of the UK population. And the strike price, the minimum price that was agreed, was the striking price of 48 British pounds per megawatt hour. For offshore wind, which it was 37 British pounds per megawatt hour. That means 1/3 of the price of nuclear, 1/9 of the price of gas at that time. It's still half of the price of gas today. And the strike price is so low that most likely the exchequer will earn 1.5 billion British pounds from that auction. And they have decided not to auction every year, not every 2 years. this renewable energy capacity should be rolled out by 2026, 2027. If UK auction the equivalent of 11 gigawatt for the next 4 years, UK could be 95% renewable energy by 2030, in line with the strategy of the government. And one of the instruments that has enabled this market transformation is basically contract for difference that provide a guarantee price and the guarantee access to the grid. So that's the third school. The third school is that I'm not to wait for markets to self-regulate. I will shape markets, and I will shape markets with my instruments. And why are they called the institutionalists? Because they consider that markets are not platonic entities coming from high hands, but basically institutions that can be shaped for the benefits of all or the benefits of a few happy few. Now, the fourth school of thought has a different view of the issues. They are saying, okay, wonderful. So you have just told us that green growth is the story of the 21st century, but you are forgetting something very important, which is that the differentiated impact of climate policies. And most climate policies will hurt the poor much more than they will hurt the rich. With what destroy environment is actually inequality. And and if you really want to address climate change, what you need is not to play with fancy instruments such as contract for difference. What you need is to invest in improving society. You will preserve climate change through preserving society, through improving society. So you are very concerned about your social tipping point where the society cannot rebuild anymore after too many natural disasters. You are very concerned about your physical tipping points, such as a breakdown of the Greenland's ice cap. Actually, you are not looking at what is the main instrument that you have, which is positive social tipping point, where you can, through activism, where you can through mass movement, when you can through investing in people, you can actually have a positive tipping point to shift the entire system. And this positive tipping point will enable you to avoid the negative climate tipping point. And so the main policy recommendation that you will have from that school of thought will be first to reduce inequalities and empower vulnerable groups, to factor inequality in all your climate policies. There is the per capita emissions of carbon is extremely unequal. And the top 1% of the world, the top 1% richest, the top richest 1% of the world, irrespective of where they are located, emit about 17% of the greenhouse gas emission, while the bottom 50%, irrespective of where they are located, emit only 12%. And so if you come with policies such as a carbon tax that basically hurts the poor and have no impact on the rich, you will basically create a lot of duress for the poor, huge transition pain, and have no impact on the real emission from the rich. And so what you need to do is that in all your climate policies, you have to factor inequality. You have to factor the gender. You have to factor the socio-economic. You have to factor the ethnic differentiated impact of climate policies. I will leave a copy of this PowerPoint for those who want to go through a few examples of these policies. And not surprisingly, one policy recommendation is that don't tax carbon, tax wealth. And uphold human rights, uphold indigenous rights, uphold women's rights. For example, the Ehrlich wrote a book, the Population Bomb in the 60s, predicting mass starvation in the 70s, 80s because of population growth. It was at the same time that the second wave of feminisms that basically gave access to women to jobs and to family planning. The net result is that we never ended up with a population, with a population bomb. And the indigenous people, lands under management by indigenous people normally have a deforestation rate which is 7 times lower than other type of land. And so the idea is that protect and uphold the rights of people. They will be the best custodian of our environmental resources. And if you really want to accelerate innovation, it's not through deregulation, it's not through industrial policies, increase the wages of people. Because when you increase the wages of people, you provide the incentives for people to invest in automation, in other machinery, etc. So it's a different type of policy recommendation. So does it matter? Which is my question. Have I just wasted 10 or 15 minutes of your time? I've asked myself this question, as I mentioned in introduction, for the past 30 years. And after 30 years of thinking very hard about it, I came to the conclusion that it did matter. And the reason why, because an environmental philosophy is extremely important. An environmental philosophy will enable you to make sense of chaos, to be able to organize different type of information, different type of data, to come with new innovation, new solution. And you will have basically an organizational paradigm to develop new instruments. So philosophy is critical. Without a philosophy, we live in a chaotic world of random data. The problem of a philosophy, of an environmental philosophy, is that it can also blind us to the other one. Why should I bother about listening to what somebody else is saying if I'm convinced that the solution to every single problem when it comes to environment is carbon tax or wealth tax? I have the solution. Now, in the practice of work of the Green Climate Fund, we have come to the conclusion that actually we need almost every single possible instrument, because when it comes to investment, there are as many barriers as instruments. And you will often end up using different type of instruments in different contexts. An instrument does not take place, an investment does not take place in a neutral environment. An investment takes place within a political economy, and there are some instruments that will work better in one political economy than another political economy. And maybe I will, now for this second part of this presentation, further try to substantiate this claim that it's important and that you will need plenty of different instruments. So climate finance. The technology is not the problem anymore when it comes to climate change. The price of solar is dropping by 10% a year. It has dropped by 90% over the past decade. That's more or less the same for wind. That's more or less the same for batteries. So today the problem is not the cost of a technology, it's basically access to finance. Now, we will expect, given the risk of not doing anything in terms of climate and the opportunities associated with this transition toward a net zero climate resilient economy, we will expect everybody to be investing in this new technologies, this new business model. And this third or fourth or fifth industrial revolution, as you wish to call it. And is it happening? No, it's definitely not happening. Last year, the total investment in climate-friendly activities was $632 billion, if my memory is correct, according to CPI. And in order to avoid catastrophic climate change, is anywhere between 1 to 7 trillion dollars a year that we will need to shift from today's economy to a net zero climate resilient economy. And we are definitely not there. And so why? this is particularly puzzled that we are not there because this investment, 2019, 2020, have taken place at a moment where we had up to $14 trillion of financial asset yielding negative returns in the world, mostly in OECD countries, while an investment in an infrastructure normally has a real return of 4 to 6%. So we had free money. We had a world of opportunities, a world of pain if we were not moving, and nothing did happen. And this is not reassuring because now we are moving toward a period of high interest rate. And so if we couldn't do it when we had negative interest rate, are we to be able to do it when we have a high interest rate? So we definitely have a major climate finance issue on our arms. And why do we have this issue? Because basically investing in infrastructure is extremely risky. It's a long-term investment, very long-term investment. You often wait 10, 15 years before you get back your money, and plenty of things can go wrong. And so let's go back to the British example of the offshore wind power with a strike price of 37 British pounds. So we take exactly the same technology. But this time, we move it from UK to an African country, where the average credit rating is B-. So first thing, your project might not be bankable because you might not have the engineers needed to be able to design the project. Your project might not be bankable because the fossil fuel might be heavily subsidized in this country. Your project might not be bankable because you might not have the shipyard needed to be able to unload the wind turbine. You might not have the road needed to bring your trucks. The project might not be bankable because you might not have the grid to which to connect your offshore wind power. And the project might not be bankable because when you are a B- country in terms of credit rating, doesn't matter if your project is great. When you will issue a bond to finance your project, the sovereign rating will be the ceiling for your bond. And so why in UK it was possible most likely to get a strike price of 37 British pounds per megawatt hour for offshore wind power, because UK is still a AA country, and therefore the cost of money at that time must have been 3 or 4%. In a B- country, it will be 18 to 24%. And with a tenure of 2 years, duration of the loan. And so, for plenty of reasons, your project might not be bankable. And finance basically price risk. And so, every time you have a risk, such as, that's the price in UK for offshore wind power. And when I don't have the engineering skill, the financial skill, paf, I put a premium on my money. When I don't have the infrastructure of the shipyard, I add another premium on my money. When your credit rating is not high, I add another premium on my money. So at the end, I will lend to you only at that cost, not at that cost. And because green technologies basically has higher upfront capital requirement, higher capex for lower operation and maintenance costs, lower OPEX. The fact that the cost of money is high disproportionately affect green technologies. And so the reason why we do not see a lot of investment is because what makes sense in the best-in-class countries can be very quickly non-bankable because of the cost of financing due to the perception or existence of real risk. Are you still with me? So I prefer to check. So literally 4,000 different environmental policy instruments, climate policy instruments have been developed in order to be able to de-risk each of these risks. For example, the investing in removing subsidies, investing in skills of people, coming with instruments such as contract for difference that guarantee that you will have a minimum price, etc. And so the first 4 types of instrument: information, regulation, economic and market instruments, and institutional instruments, can basically work both at the supply and demand side of market creation. And it's a systemic change. The 5th type of instrument, financial instruments, will de-risk a specific investment that will establish a commercial track record. You will see in this list all the instruments that I have mentioned in the 4 schools of philosophies. And each of these instruments will be needed in different geographies. And so the heart of the policymakers is to basically figure out what kind of public policy instrument, what kind of financial instruments will be needed to go back to maybe not the cost of money of the best in class, but something close, something that makes the project bankable. And the last thing you want when you do this kind of exercises is to have is to suffer from tunnel vision, where you think that you know the one instrument. Because I'm not aware about a single instrument in the world that can, in a cost-effective manner, basically address several types of risk. You can go with a tax, for example, a carbon tax, but your carbon tax will have to be $300 or $400 per ton. It will be beyond inefficient. That's the reason why, for me, environmental philosophies do matter when it comes to climate change, in good and in bad. In good, as an organizational framework; in bad, as potentially something that will lead to tunnel vision. Now, I've been asked to say a few things about GCF. Do I still have time? So GCF, the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund basically financed its first project in November 2015. The Green Climate Fund became the largest climate fund in the world become the largest climate fund in the world by 2020. We are a partnership organization. We do not originate our own projects. We work with more than 200 organizations worldwide, from some of the largest commercial banks in the world, such as Mitsubishi Bank, Deutsche Bank, BNP Paribas, to civil society organizations. And between the two, multilateral development bank, UN agencies, private equity funds, etc. And so, de facto, we have been designed to serve as a hub, if not the hub, of the climate finance landscape. We are capital agnostic, and as far as I know, we are one of the only institutions in the world. We are capitalized in grant, and UK is our largest financier as of today. Just before Japan, France, and Germany, and Sweden. But we can convert this grant into any kind of grant or non-grant instruments. So we can provide concessional debts, equity, guarantees, insurances, whatever is needed in order to de-risk a project. So we will use our grant, for example, for capacity development, for information disclosure, etc., etc., and our non-grant for de-risking a project that will establish a track record. And we are a patient risk capital provider. We can invest for the long term, so we can invest in a new technologies that will reach maturity in 10, 15 years. And we are willing to take basically junior positions such as first loss equity, first loss guarantee, etc. It's a completely unique institution in the world. On the other hand, we do not have a lot of money. It's $2.5 billion a year. We account for about 3% of the UNFCCC finance and 0.05% of the total climate finance needs. And so a key question for us is it's basically how to be a powerful drop in climate finance. How can we use limited public money to foster transformative change? And so we have adopted a four-pronged approach. The first prong is that we support transformative planning. The second prong, we catalyze innovation. The third one is that we de-risk investments that will establish a commercial track record. And the fourth one is that we try to green the financial system, not financial instrument, greening the financial system. I will give very quickly an example. So in terms of transformative planning, it can be 50 times more expensive, for example, when it comes to increasing the resilience of infrastructure, to increase the resilience of individual infrastructure rather than increasing the resilience of networks. And so, for example, we try to help countries to identify their electricity networks or water networks or road networks or telecommunication network, to overlay to that their hazard maps, and to identify what are the most vulnerable nodes, and to figure out for each of these nodes whether they can afford to have them offline for 2 weeks because the car will take another pathway, the electricity will take another pathway, or whether you cannot afford to have these nodes, to have these assets offline. And when this has been done, what is the best mix of gray and green infrastructure in order to protect gray and green solution in order to protect this infrastructure? And after, what is the best way to finance it? And so, what kind of project can be financed by the private sector without a public penny? What kind of project will require a policy de-risking, such as, for example, streamlining the licensing process, providing a guarantee access to the grid? What kind of projects will require policy de-risking and financial de-risking, such as concessional debt, such as first loss equity? And what kind of projects can only be financed by the public sector? And how do you finance it? With a carbon tax, a wealth tax? What kind of other fiscal instruments or innovative instruments? And so there, through our support to transformative planning, we try to engage government in a discussion on all the different policy options. Today, we are the largest provider of what we call capacity development for climate change. We have provided close to $500 million of capacity development grant to 141 countries to try to support this kind of transformative plan. You have seen a common point among all the school of thought, the importance of innovation. Even the naturalist school of thought focus on innovation, but innovation toward other type of innovation. We will not address climate change without innovation. And not only technological innovation, but also policy innovation, financial innovation. And what GCF does is that we basically support incubators and accelerators in developing countries, and also develop what we call specialty finance, special financial mechanism for enabling innovators in developing countries to ground truth their new climate solution and to access some initial finance. And so, for example, here we have a project called CRAFT, where we are using an innovative financing instrument to finance the development of innovative adaptation technologies. And what we have done there is that this project is $400 million of equity that will be invested in startups, that will be invested in SMEs. And adaptation technologies is regarded as relatively risky investment. So we provided $100 million of first loss equity. We are the first to lose our money if it doesn't work, in order to reassure more senior investors, institutional investors, to come on board. And it's to promote new adaptation technologies. So once we have a new solution, with the first prong, we have created an enabling environment for new climate solution. Once, with the second prong, we have been supporting climate innovators to develop, to ground truth our new climate solution. When we have a new climate solution, what we try to do is basically to de-risk it, to establish, to support the first application at commercial scale of this new climate solution. And for de-risking, we will be using a mix of policy instruments and financial instruments. Establishing the first application at commercial scale is critical because a banker cannot deal with uncertainty. A banker can only deal with risk. A banker can price risk, cannot price uncertainty. Once you have a commercial track record, a banker can finance the next project. That's the first one, which is extremely difficult to get in place. And this one, my apologies, this one is a bit complex as a graph, but just to explain the big bucket, this one is a private equity fund for renewable energy in low-income countries, mostly in Asia. And this one, we established this one several years ago when renewable energy was still more expensive and more risky than it is today. And there we came first with a grant to basically cover the project development cost. Very risky for an entrepreneur to spend millions of dollars developing a new project. Almost 90% of the projects will never see the light of the day. And this can cost 5 to 10% of the cost of a project to develop it. So what we are doing is that we are providing grant for entrepreneurs. If the project fails, the project fails. If the project does not fail, when the project is commissioned, we reimburse ourselves by converting the grant into equity. And that's the second component. There we have provided first loss equity for the projects to move. And the objective is that once our portfolio has reached maturity, we will basically aggregate it in asset-backed security that we will offload to markets. And so de-risking can basically become fairly complex and establish and require different type of instruments. And I'm not aware about a single instrument in the world that will de-risk this kind of initiative. And the fourth prong is that once we have a commercially proven solution, we help the domestic financial institutions to basically finance its widespread adoption. And there, for example, we will help the banks to be able to incorporate climate risk into investment appraisal, to be able to disclose our climate risk, the climate-related risk of their portfolio, to be able to develop or to adopt green taxonomy, and this will be critical for them to be able to access different type of finance, such as by issuing bonds, and we can, for example, provide guarantees for the bonds. And in order, because a lot of this is fairly risky, we have put in place a relatively sophisticated double diligence system where we rely on the due diligence of our partners, and we have our own second level due diligence to ensure that we operate as a risk-patient capital in a responsible manner. And that's it.
Yannick, thank you so much for that tour de force, not just of philosophy, but also of climate finance. I'm not sure I've heard recently or even ever a kind of a clear explanation of why an offshore wind plant, for example, might cost a different amount in the UK than it is in a developing country. So really important information. The floor is open for questions and discussion points. I'd ask you to wait to receive the microphone before speaking and to briefly introduce yourself before doing so. I remember we are being recording this, so just remember that. Is there maybe a first question from a student? Please. Two first questions.
Thank you. My name is Katrina. I'm just about, as of tomorrow, to be a recent graduate of the Blavatnik School of Government. I was wondering, when we're thinking about egalitarian policy tools, one of the tools that you had mentioned was gender. And I've worked a lot previously in the carbon crediting space in East Africa. and gender was a big component of my work there. And I was just wondering, from your perspective, really zooming out and taking a global view, if you have seen any kind of practical policy instruments that can help with finance increasing women's participation in carbon crediting and similar types of spaces. Thank you.
Great question. And for those of you who may not know, Yannick has, in his prior role, worked as the Assistant Secretary General with Under Secretary General
UN Women.
with UN Women. So I think we'll have a lot of thoughts on this question.
Do we take several
Yes.
one or do it?
Why don't we start with that one?
First, speaking about the Green Climate Fund, every single of our projects must have a gender action plan. And but we are very far from where I would like to be, because most of the gender action plans that we have are gender mainstreaming, not gender action plan, in the sense that they are very much about doing no harm, which is already good to take a hard look at gender differentiated impact, but it's only one part of the work. So doing no harm and ensuring, for example, a minimum percentage of female participation in training. I mean, we have to go far, far beyond that. We are not even scratching the surface of what we could achieve through empowering women as agent of change when it comes to climate change. For example, in terms of climate resilient agriculture, if we could give to a woman farmer, who account for half of the farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, the same access to information, to land, to technology, to finance. Some estimates will say that we could increase food production by 25% and reduce the number of malnourished by 150 million people. When it comes to decentralized renewable energy, women sellers outsell male sellers by normally a ratio of 1:3, 1:4, because most of those who use decentralized renewable energy devices, improved cook stove, happen to be the women. So women sellers, first, in some societies, they are the only one who can enter in their house. Second, they understand better the need of their customers. So I would have expected, given the immense potential of women empowerment to address climate change, to see this left, right, and center. And it's still the exception. And for me, it's I hope that we will see a new generation of climate practitioners who will take seriously this challenge.
I think, Katrina, your question is very helpful because it helps to elucidate the synthesis you gave us of these four different schools of thought across these two dimensions: growth, no growth, policy, no policy. And certainly, you've given us a beautiful system sort of view of how the different pieces are all needed to create this bigger change. And some people might not start by thinking women and gender is the way to get to the climate goals, but if you take the systems level view, you can see the connections quite clearly. However, my slight critique or question might be, this is the reason these philosophies are in different quadrants is people don't always agree on which of these dimensions should be prioritized. And indeed, maybe if we are some sort of systems level view of the world, we can say, yes, we need us all to come together, but you have a board of different countries and they have to take different views. Those countries are, of course, accountable to their political systems, and they all tend to have different views on this kind of question. So so if we can agree in the abstract on the synthesis view, don't choices have to be made, and isn't that the role of politics to kind of adjudicate that? And how can we promote this holistic view you've given under the conditions we face politically?
Not only have a board reflecting different sensibilities, but we have also 200 partners. So you can imagine that's one of the top commercial banks in the world might have a different sensibilities, and a civil society organization working at the community level. And for me, that's one of our greatest added value as the Trust Fund, is that we work with all of them. And when we get a climate project, we submit it to a number of tests. And the first one is climate impact. Is it to make a difference in terms of climate impact? We get a lot of good commercial projects, a lot of good development projects who have next to no climate impact. So that's the first thing. The second thing is additionality. Will these projects see the light of the day without us? And are we about to waste public money by providing some money? The third one is sustainability. Will it outlast the intervention? The fourth one, most important for us, is scalability. Can it reach scale very, very fast? And the fifth one, and the one linked to your question, is efficiency. Are we using the right set of tools? And there we often engage with our partners saying, why do you want to go for concessional debt here rather than guarantee? And why not to invest in the simplifying the licensing process rather than subsidizing this initiative with a ton of public money? And the last test, when we have done all of that one, is concessionality. That means what is the level of money that we have to give you? But today, one of the greatest added value of a second level due diligence institution such as the Green Climate Fund is that we will be asking you these questions. And for a number of our partners, but I've always provided concessional debt.
Yes. I think this kind of cross-cutting nature of the systems view is maybe how you, as a drop in the ocean, are an influential drop, is a very good way of thinking about it. Let's take about three questions if I could. I see one here in the front, one in the back, and then one there. So why don't you start with the one here in front? Thanks, Ben.
Thank you. My name is Methal Kavi. I'm a student for Professor Thomas Hell, and currently I'm a finance lead of UAE COP28. And one of the things when I've been sitting with developing countries, I hear that countlessly is accessing finance, especially from GCF. And that's, when I speak to them, it takes years for them to access finance, and sometimes for those countries, change their priorities. And sometimes it's hard for them to bring what you call it bankable pipelines or bankable projects. Now, to help those countries easily accessing finance, especially from GCF, given that is more grants and more attractive to those who are the most vulnerable, what we can do and what GCF are going to basically easy the accessing the finance for those countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Maita. Should we take a few, actually, because I'm conscious of the time.
Okay, but very quickly, for maybe that one.
Please.
It's the GCF is at its optimal for projects of $200 to $500 million. And we invest in high impact but high risk initiative in non-investment grade countries. And so our due diligence is very demanding. But for $250 to $500 million, we are basically the fastest in the industry. The problem is that if you want $500,000, it will take us as long, because we have not been designed for $500,000. And we account for only 3% of the finance of the UNFCCC, but we are working with 141 countries, and often we are the only fund that people know. And so paradoxically, there is a problem of accessing our resources, but we know how to access it. And a big part of our job is often to tell our partners, why don't you go to that source of finance, which is much more appropriate for what you need, the sum of the remaining 97%. No, we still have to be able to provide $500,000 or $1 million. And so what we have been doing over the past couple of years is recognizing the fact that we are not a fund for a small fund, is that we now come with pool fund. And so, for example, for the Federated States of Micronesia, what we did is that we provided 30 or $40 million to the National Climate Fund, because this fund had very good processes for them after to break down this money into 100 small grants led by community. So that's the money once we have approved our transfer, after it can be very fast. We did in Vanuatu, we did something similar with Save the Children Australia. And so we try to use pool funds for smaller projects now.
Thank you. Question in the back.
Thank you so much, Yannick. May I just say how refreshing it is to have someone from a climate fund speaking through philosophy. And it's very clear that it informs the work of the GCF. So thank you for that. My question was, since you spoke so much about equity, what are some of the ways in which GCF is helping finance get sort of redistributed from the developing world to developing countries? You spoke to it briefly in terms of sovereign risk, allowing finance even when sovereign risk ratings are low, etc. Maybe one other way is through working with organizations like BIS and the Basel Committee on changing financial regulations to make sustainable finance a little bit more affordable and accessible. So large international financial institutions can finance projects in developing countries as well. So is that something GCF does, or are there other modes?
Thank you very much. Can we take the other question here, and then, if that's okay, I'll pull in a little bit.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jim Hall, Professor of Climate and Environmental Risks, and actually working with some of your colleagues on infrastructure risk analysis in Jamaica. But I mean, this is a beautiful account of the steps one needs to go through to untangle the different layers of risk, which are pushing up the cost of capital. And yet, if you think about each of those layers, they imply regulatory, market reforms, capacity building institutionally, physical things on the ground to create connectivity. So the question is, I mean, these things are difficult anywhere, and they're particularly difficult in fragile parts of the world. Have we got time to do all of those reforms which will take out those layers of risk which you've explained so clearly to us?
Right. So equity and time.
Regarding changes in the macroprudential legislation in the world, some institutions are much better equipped than us to do it. And I will think about IMF, I will think about the G20. It's definitely not our forte. As you might have seen, we are not macroeconomists, we are microeconomists. We look at the incentives at the level of a firm, at the incentives of the level of an investment. In terms of do we have time? And the one thing we know is that you do not have to wait for perfection for being able to de-risk investment. You have some investment that even in an overall business environment that are not perfect can actually lower the level of risk and lower the cost of money to the level where it's bankable. We can transform a market in 10 to 15 years, about. And in almost any kind of jurisdiction. The complexity is that the portfolio of policy instruments that you will need to use will change from one location to another one, because you will not change the entire society. You cannot wait to change society to start addressing climate change. So you will have to figure out what kind of targeted climate change instruments lower the risk to a level, to an acceptable level within an overall environment that will be a constant for the project duration of your initiative, for the duration of your initiative. But it's possible. It's possible, but it's never to be the same instruments. So here again, the bigger your toolbox, the better it is.
Just can I build on that question? Are there any cases where a GCF project has been created in one country has actually made it faster, easier for a similar project to be done in another country, where you're seeing this kind of accelerating diffusion through your own work? Or is it very so different that you don't have these kinds of feedbacks?
One of the worst fallacies of development is the concept of best practices. And there was an entire school of thought about best practices. Often something works in a country because this thing is removing 50 years of bad policies. And so this thing is not good, but because it's removing something worse, it actually works. And if you take these things that it seems to work very well and you put it in a different environment, you basically introduce an element which is extremely detrimental to that other environment. Because there is almost no jurisdiction where things are perfect, you will always have to come with a very specific portfolio of instruments. So a success helps because you have a track record. A success in terms of technology help everything, all the intangible, such as the technology, help a lot, but it's not too, it will take a while before it's become a little bread machinery. You do reach, when the market mature, you reach the level where this goes on its own. For example, renewable energy in high-income countries and emerging economies. No, it's 98% driven by the private sector. You don't need any public money. It goes full speed, but it still does not go in low-income countries. So you have to reach a fairly high degree of market maturity before you can do a carbon copy of one initiative somewhere else.
Great. I think we have time for one final set of questions. Can I take Jose Maria and over here, please?
So actually, this is a follow-up to this question. This is actually a follow-up to this question, in fact, because in my understanding is that there's a lot of projects that are actually multi-country and multi-region within the fund. So what have been the trade-off or the experience of having these multi-region projects?
You will need a multi-country and multi-region project for several reasons. First, for example, if it's private equity, you need the country diversification for reducing the country risk. For example, we are investing in a $500 million private equity fund for coral reef protection. It's a high-risk initiatives, and therefore you need to be able to have projects in different jurisdictions, so that if you have a problem in one jurisdiction, it's not to impact your entire portfolio. So a multi-country project is almost a prerequisite for potentially high-risk initiative. You will also go for multi-country project for technological development. The technology is really the exception where you can take a carbon copy approach. And for technology to be profitable, you will often have to deploy it in several different geographies. Also, you will need multiple countries for example, an instrument such as a bond or again a private equity fund or a catastrophe insurance to be financially sustainable. In seeds, the markets are too small, so you will have to aggregate all the markets into a sub-regional initiative. When you have common ecosystems, when you are looking at nature-based solution, you will need to have all the neighboring countries together. So there are plenty of reasons why you will have to go for multi-country projects to reduce risk and be efficient and have a broader range of options.
Very clear. And final question, please.
Michael Obersteiner from the Environmental Change Institute. Thank you for lecturing French and Austrian philosophy. My question is when I look at kind of your risk analysis, and you pointed out this policy matrix which you co-authored with Jean-Charles Rocade, I guess.
I developed this table, but for a joint publication led by Jean-Charles Rocade.
What I had the impression is you are actually subsidizing for the lack of policies and policy incentives with your money. Is that a fair criticism?
No, you don't want to do it. You don't want to subsidize for lack of policies. You have to do it. As I was just mentioning before, you cannot wait for society to be perfect to take action, and you cannot wait for every single policy barriers to be removed. And so from time to time, you have to accept imperfection. You have to accept that you will have to subsidize for these policy barriers. But you try to do it as little as possible. When we use financial instruments, it's often to de-risk the first application at commercial scales. And that is not linked to subsidy. When any first in technology or in infrastructure design is very risky. And there it's provide a justification for actually using public money to de-risk it. So indeed, you can use financial de-risking instrument to subsidize for the imperfection of the policy framework, and you have to do it, but normally you should try to do it as little as possible, and I think you use it for de-risking the first application.
Thank you. So we're coming to the end of our time. I know we have a number of questions. The conversation can continue, though, once we draw things to a close. But I would be very remiss as a moderator without asking two very rapid-fire questions, because you mentioned in your talk that today the UK has become the largest supporter of the Green Climate Fund. Just wondered if you might elaborate on that in light of recent reporting on the UK's contributions. And two, will we leave COP27 with a new picture on climate finance? Sorry to start that one for the end.
The UK is the main financial contributors. I think it's in terms of financial contributors to GCF for the first replenishment that took place in 2019 for the 2020-2023 period. The largest contributor was UK, followed by Japan, followed by France, followed by Germany, followed by Sweden and Norway. When you take the initial replenishment and the first replenishment, it's actually Japan followed by UK. But indeed, UK is an extremely strong supporter of the Green Climate Fund, and not only in terms of contribution to the replenishment, but we often co-finance with UK some of our most innovative projects. For example, we have established a green guarantee company to provide 100% guarantees to a project in developing countries, so that if the project is not, if the country is B-, the rating of the bond will be the rating of the company, BBB+. For us, it was providing 100% of the equity of such a guarantee was too risky, and so we did partner with UK for that. So we received funds from UK to our trust fund, plus we regularly partner with UK as a co-investor in some projects.
Great. And prospects for climate finance at COP27?
Well, let's say that we are not to meet the $100 billion. This we already know. So it's not to make negotiation easier, because it's when you negotiate, you need to negotiate. Trust is an extraordinarily important currency for negotiation, and any kind of breach of contract basically has a cost in terms of trust. So the fact that we have not met the $100 billion is perceived by a number of countries as a breach. And it's particularly difficult to accept it, given that OECD countries have provided close to $500 billion of subsidies to protect our most vulnerable communities from the energy crisis. But for the vulnerable communities in the south, it's difficult to accept that you provide $500 billion to your vulnerable communities, but not to their vulnerable communities. So that will make it definitely difficult. It will make it easier to everybody and for everything to reach the $100 billion.
Indeed. Well, for that reason, we wish you the best of luck next week at COP27 and also beyond in the very important work you do. And thank you so much for joining us today to speak through philosophy and concreteness. Thank you.